Have you ever gone skiing with dull edges? It can feel like the snow and the ice is just pushing whichever direction it wants to take you. And there's just a lack of control for where you end up. And that's exactly what it feels like in life when you're living out of alignment with yourself. Life happens and you just get pushed around in whichever direction. And that's why I'm so grateful to have Dr. Lucille Necas on the podcast today to talk about how you can live authentically, embrace your inner authority, and create the life that you desire with a sense of peace and fulfillment in your life. Dr. Lucille Necas is a holistically and spiritually oriented psychiatrist and psychotherapist. With over 35 years, she has supported her clients in attaining their best lives, no matter where they start on their mental health journey. Her primary modality is EMDR, which she finds to be one of the best processes to empower people to connect with their own innate healing capacity and wisdom. She is also a co-host along with Lynn Hardy, a naturopath and clinical nutritionist of the Rewilded Human podcast. Their mission is to help people unload misconceptions, limiting beliefs, and maladaptive behaviors so they can live their best lives and most natural lives. I truly enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Lucille Necas, and I'm so grateful to share it with you today. All right. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Lucille Necas. I cannot wait to have this conversation. I know this is going to be so valuable for people listening. So thank you again for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm honored to be on your podcast because I love the work that you're doing with women. It really aligns with what my mission in this world. So that's great. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yes, I think, and likewise, I just, if anyone who's listening does not follow you already, definitely follow your Instagram feed, because there's so much value in that, and just the messages are so healing. So I want to first start getting into this because we're going to talk about forgiveness and authenticity. But before we get into that, do you mind just sharing some of your story? How did you get into the work that you do, and what is some of the backstory of that?
Well, the backstory goes right back to the first days of my life. To be perfectly honest, I'll try to keep it very short and brief. But basically, I was born in a war zone. I was born actually in a very, middle class suburban setting here in Toronto. To all the outside world, my family was, pretty much standard average family. But behind closed doors, my parents were conducting a war between the two of them. And it was, to say horrendous is sometimes an understatement. I don't want to paint myself as a victim, but if you're an only child in a family where your parents are totally dysregulated, like I would not know every morning what I would face when I got up and went downstairs. My mother had bipolar disorder, and my father, he was quite narcissistic. And at the time in the 50s, there were traditional roles that the men and women took. And he could not in any way either deal with my mother's mental illness or deal with her desire to be more than just a housewife and mother in suburban Toronto. And he was totally out of his league in dealing with the ups and downs of a bipolar person with bipolar, which led me to kind of have to figure everything out on my own and learn to self-regulate, which as a young child, that's really hard to do. It's almost impossible if you don't have a loving adult presence that can help soothe you and explain the world to you, and be someone that you could go to reliably and trust with whatever you needed. It is really challenging. So I have a huge amount of compassion and empathy for a lot of my clients over the years who faced that kind of background. So I learned to, to be resilient, to be on my own, to figure things out on my own, which was really hard. But what I was left with also was a lot of chronic anxiety and depression when I was growing up. And the only way I knew how to deal with that was really to escape somehow into books or into nature, which are two things that I think are really very healing, right? And in many ways, if you have nothing else, those two things are amazing. Thankfully, we didn't have the technology then that we do now. So I couldn't get lost in a phone, which I think is a blessing, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
You have two kids, right? So you kind of probably are dealing with that kind of issue with them. But for me, it was just like, as I say, it was like a war zone. Either my parents were always battling, or it was Cold War. They weren't talking, or because my mother had bipolar, she'd be carted off to hospital every once in a while. So it was truly a roller coaster. And the one thing I also remember right from the get-go was this sense that there's got to be more to life than this. I don't think I'm here for this, just to survive this. And so I developed my own little childlike experience of spirituality very early on. And then, as I grew up, fast forward, I realized that I had a gift for understanding other people's mental imbalances, right? And you always know when you're going into a certain field of or career that some of it is influenced by your past. And so for me, it really was about, I was trying to heal myself and in an indirect way kind of heal my parents and their very dysfunctional background. So I ended up in psychiatry at the University of Toronto eventually, not surprisingly. And there's a whole other backstory to that, but I realized in doing that that was also another form of dysfunctional family system. And I could not see myself working in a hospital system or even in a clinic setting because it was just so, to me, in many ways, anti-human. And so I made the brave move of just going out into private practice soon after I graduated, and I've never looked back. It has given me the freedom to pursue whatever I felt I needed to pursue to help my clients without, Big Brother, some hospital administration, whatever, looking over my shoulder. So, and from there, I just explored. I was so eager just to explore the world, explore more of spirituality. I eventually also trained in EMDR, which I do for my clients for the most part now. I focus very strongly on psychotherapy. And while I do occasionally prescribe medications, I do so only when we've exhausted the possibilities of lifestyle changes, which I feel are really the most valuable in a person's healing. So, that in a nutshell is my origin story, and here I am.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing, because it's like those stories I think just really help connect us all, and realizing like we all come from maybe different backgrounds, but we all can have a theme of that we can relate to and see how, how people navigate those things. For someone who maybe is listening, has a narcissistic parent, they're like, okay, like how do I start to heal myself from that? And just hearing those stories of your evolution, and just gives people hope in that they can live a different way. And one thing you talked about was that emotional regulation. Could you mind diving into that a little bit more? Because I think that's something that, we may hear about, but like, it's often a skill we are never given in life. And it's something that is absolutely crucial. And can you talk about that? How did you cultivate that emotional regulation when you really had no resources as a child? And really, what did that look like as it evolved through your adulthood?
Yeah, so there's this developmental piece that we all have to do, right? And you know this very well, Kelly, that we have to learn how to soothe ourselves. So self-regulation is basically, a lot of it is just how to self-soothe. And if you come from a background where your parents never soothed you, and they in turn were never soothed, so they had no idea how to do it in a healthy way. It is a huge challenge because it haunts you for the rest of your life, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So in my case, as I said, the self-soothing came from escape. It came from what I was able to do was when I went out into nature, like my parents had a cottage, and I would spend the entire summer pretty much out in the woods, just exploring,
Mm-hmm.
which I think a lot of parents now would look at that in horror and go, oh my God, that's dangerous. At that time, it was not. And I found being in the woods just so soothing and so calming. And I also, I would always dive into books. I was, a lifelong learner from the get-go. And that also opened me up to other worlds that were lovely and beautiful and where people got along, and or there was adventure, but it was the kind of adventure where you came out at the other end and you triumphed, and so those were the ways. And also I had a sense that something was watching over me. I just had a sense, you know. So I was very lucky in that way that I could find these things to self-soothe. It wasn't 100% because I do think you need another human being to mirror your emotional state and help you regulate it, and so you kind of need that other mature nervous system there for you. But the way I did it, and I think a lot of kids do it in these kinds of circumstances, is certainly a lot better than nothing. It's certainly a lot better than what some people face. So, and as we get older, of course, we hopefully learn more sophisticated, healthy, self-soothing techniques. Like I got into things like meditation and yoga, and I for a time I got dysregulated. I have to insert this part because I started binge drinking when I was in medical school. The stress was so high, and I hadn't really learned how to self-regulate as well as I should. And I had a boyfriend at the time who was also a heavy drinker. And so I went off the rails for a few years. And then I kind of came back to myself. And when the stress of medical school was over, it was kind of like I just let out a big sigh of relief. And I stopped having a craving to drink, thankfully. And then I went on more of my own alternative healing journey at that point. So yes, self-soothing is something that is so crucial for all of us. That's the basis of self-regulation, right? So that's how I did it.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I think it can't be said enough, because I think this is something that lacks in so many aspects, especially after us all coming off a pandemic. It can be this place of where there's so much disarray and turmoil going on internally, and we may not even have the tools to get out of that. And one thing I want to talk about and go and dive in deeper is that you talked about coming back to yourself. And I think this is something that, I really want to get into, because we can easily get lost in the external world telling us who we are, what we should think, what we should do. And it can be really challenging to listen to the inner whisper of who we are when we have everybody yelling at us. Can you talk about that and why it's so important that we anchor ourselves into our authentic selves?
Well, because it is an anchor. It is your ultimate anchor in this world. You have, and we all have, a direct connection to wisdom, I believe, through our hearts, through going deep into that inner knowing that we are a part of something larger than our day-to-day world and what we represent in our day-to-day world. And so you cannot, it's almost impossible to get to that place of authenticity if you don't spend, as I would say, significant amount of time alone, like meditation, going into a meditative state, or journaling, just doing some, inner dialoguing, being out in nature. This is where we open up the portal to our inner knowing of who we really are and what is really of value to us. How shall I put it? The catch-22, though, is if you come from a highly dysfunctional home and you've never learned how to soothe properly, and you've, been a victim of a lot of abuse, a lot of people are afraid of spending time alone, right? They are petrified of doing things like meditation, of being silent, of spending time in a room alone. They're always looking for someone to connect with who's going to validate their experience or pull them out of a state of loneliness or distract them, or they give up their power to other people to give them the wisdom that they feel they don't have. So these would be the women who, they cannot be alone. They cannot structure their own time. They dread the weekends. They always have to find something to do with somebody. They cling to the men in their lives and have to do everything with the men. They cannot end a relationship without already starting in another relationship, that kind of chain of relationships. And that is what I think keeps a lot of women disempowered. And it also applies to men as well, but it keeps people really disempowered, and therefore if they don't come off that roller coaster of constantly needing other people there to help regulate themselves, then they're vulnerable for the rest of their lives, right? They really cannot come into their own. They don't have an inner core of strength. They don't really know who they are. And that's where, I know, see a lot of women where they abandon themselves. They have no idea who they are. And so they are just about the next task, the next relationship, the next performance expectation, whatever, right? But a key always to authenticity is you have to learn who you are, right? You have to spend time with yourself. You're the most important person in your life. So the long-winded answer to a very, very good question.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that, because it is just one of those things that, like, you can go your whole life and not even question it because it's just what you've always known. So, like, then to go into that space where you are quiet, for maybe someone who's listening and is like, okay, I do that, I go into the quiet space, but maybe they have the negative chatter going on all the time. What's something that, how do you go from that place where it's like, it could be almost menacing, thinking all these thoughts, and you're like, oh, this is so, like, unpleasant to be alone that I don't want to do this. How can you start to transition where that becomes a place where you can really tune into yourself rather than being just shrouded in the negative thoughts?
Well, there are many ways to do it. It really depends on what a person is ready for. Okay. So, for example, if you learn that you are not your thoughts, okay, this is a basic wisdom in all older spiritual traditions. And this is what the purpose of meditation is. It's not to get, engulfed in all your negative thoughts. It's really about being able to just stand apart from them and observe them without having any attachment. And the principle is, you're watching your thoughts come in and then go, and they come in and then they go. And then you realize, wow, nothing here is solid or stable, right? So I do advocate meditation, but I know it's hard for a lot of people, as you say, who are very afraid of that silence and being bombarded by the negative thoughts. But one thing I advocate for those people among my clientele is then try some chanting. There are many ways to do meditation. So chanting, focusing on a mantra, learning walking meditation. can be very, very helpful. I don't think there's one standard, one size fits all. But to be able to just come into command of yourself enough to just observe your thoughts and realize you're not your thoughts. However you get there, I think that's terrific. So, so there are many, many forms of meditation. It's still one thing that I would suggest. And the other thing is what I did and what a lot of people do now is you go into nature. It's you can still be bombarded by negative thoughts, but you might notice that, wow, the longer you're out there, the more peaceful, the calmer you are. I have so much concern really about people who live in the urban jungle who are basically in relationship with their tech. And they don't set foot into a proper natural environment. That's another place where you truly find yourself, because we are part of nature. And as the longer you are in nature, the more nature starts pulling out of you who you really are. Now, other things can do that too. Pets can do that, whatever it is for you, where you go and you have an experience and you just start feeling, yeah, I feel I'm more myself here. My nerves are calmer. My thoughts are more peaceful. Maybe I'm having positive insights about things. Truly, everybody has a capacity to heal from whatever they've gone through. And I think, Kelly, you would be on board with this, definitely.
100%.
Yeah, because in the work that I've done, especially with things like EMDR, where you're rewiring a person's nervous system, the person always goes to a state of balance and positivity. Always. It's kind of like in our nature, that's our bedrock. So everything else that happened to us is kind of piled on top, and it feels like this huge burden to live with it all and all. But really, we're going through a process of, shall I call it excavation, where you're unlayering all the stuff that never was really meant to be there so that you can get down to who you genuinely are, who you are meant to be in this world. And it's not all the negative thought, and it's not all the trauma, and it's not, all of your experiences. We can certainly learn from our experiences, etc. But you are far, far, far more than your thoughts and what you experienced in your life. And you will, when you do your healing work, you will go back to that certainty of who you really are.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I think that's such a huge thing. That was a huge part of like my healing journey, is realizing, oh, I'm not my thoughts. Like for years, I thought I was my thoughts. And I'm like, what is wrong with me that I was thinking all these things? And then I was like identifying with them. And once I could see that separation, it really was such a game changer. So I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's such a catalyst for just healing internally and even within your body. And just
Absolutely.
to kind of, yeah, I mean, they go completely hand in hand. Just going off what you were saying, I mean, like our body is always seeking out homeostasis. So it will constantly seek out how to get back to its most purest form. So I completely agree. Your body is perpetually trying to get back to healing, and we just have to allow it to do that. And so many times we stop it in the process.
Yes. We get it, as they say, we get in our own ways. And that's because the logic mind is has been so programmed by the negative thinking, by the survival instincts, not to tread into quote unquote dangerous territory, which most people actually do believe that if they go into in-depth work like therapy, that somehow they're going to uncover more and more and more of this horror that's them. They'll fall into the abyss. And it's the opposite. It's quite the opposite. People are amazed by how they come spontaneously into things like remembering positive memories that they completely disconnected from, into having insights about themselves, about how wonderful they really were as children. They really weren't the awful, worthless human beings that they were programmed to believe they were.
Yeah.
It's quite amazing when you see that miracle of them blossoming, into who they really are.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
And I want to go deeper into that because I know you use programming, and I would love to just hear your perspective on that, because programming, like that subconscious programming we have from kids then carries into our life unless we address it and transform that and rewire it. Can you talk about how that really plays a role in us not connecting with our authenticity and really seeking out something else to many times validate the programming we have?
Absolutely. Well, this is the huge challenge of life, right? Because I think we're programmed right from the get-go. The moment we're born, you see children being just spontaneous and playful, and immediately somebody comes down on them. Now, there are some enlightened parents who are, and I'm sure you're one of them, Kelly, where you you um you understand that the child needs to be authentic and genuine, and you give them that allowance to play, and they will do inappropriate things, but when you correct them in a way that where they learn, but they don't feel shamed or emotionally shut down or any of that. It's such a delicate balance. This is why I admire
Yeah.
good parents so much, because it is such a dance of letting your child just be, but also very gently and compassionately correcting them so that they know how to be in the world, so that they can be genuine and authentic in themselves. And there's a place for that expression. And at the same time, they're not going out and offending people in the supermarket by saying, "Why are you so fat?" That sort of thing, right? So, the interesting thing is that children, as you know, Kelly, children, if you really observe them carefully, they will tell you what their authentic self is. You watch them, you watch their play, you watch what they gravitate to, you watch how they develop, what they love doing the most, and and you then can guide them beautifully in nurturing that. But in our world, especially in the world that I was born into, it was very much regimented, extremely regimented. And where the corporal punishment was okay, kids did something embarrassing in the grocery store, and they'd get smacked up the head, and nobody would say anything, right? It was horrendous. It really was. I can only imagine what people went through. Well, they tell me all the time what they went through behind closed doors, but how massive that all was behind closed doors. And so right from the get-go, we are taught that what we do spontaneously is bad and deserves to be punished. And you are rewarded only when you meet expectations, the outside expectations. And so it is, from cradle to grave, it's like we have to conform to what is demanded of us by external authorities. We are not encouraged to look inward. When I was growing up, you ate what was on the plate, and if you didn't eat it, you didn't get any more. That was it. But I saw a lot of people in my practice who, for example, they could not tolerate the food. That's a simple thing. They couldn't tolerate the food that their parents prepared for them. They had microbiome issues from all the stress of living in their families, for example, and they literally couldn't stomach the food, and so it set up huge difficulties for them. The mental dysregulation and the physical dysregulation just was ongoing until they, some of them eventually found their way to balance. But it is so difficult when people are taught that it is bad to look inward. You must look outward to find out who you really are. And so people can say the word authentic up, down, and sideways. But most people, especially, in my generation, would have no idea what that means because they've never encountered themselves, their authentic self. They have no idea. So as you say, and this is your mission too, a lot of women in particular were bred to serve. They were bred to be caregivers. They were bred to cater to everybody else's needs, and they got rewarded for that, right? There was some
100%.
reward for that, right? And the unfortunate thing is then that they really lose themselves in that, and they don't read their own signals that say, enough, I cannot spend another, lengthy night up talking to my friend, talking them through their horrible marital situation. I cannot spend 50 hours a week at my job as a nurse any longer. It's killing me. We do not allow ourselves to really listen to those signals. I really found it shocking when I was going through medical school, for example. The nursing staff, who were amazing. I mean, they really helped me a lot get through my medical training because they were so knowledgeable. They were frontline. They knew, practically speaking, how to treat patients. But they were treated like dirt. I'm sorry to say that. They were really treated like dirt. They were not. The staff doctors would come in and they would do their rounds and they would sort of ask the nurse, well, how did the patient do overnight, blah, blah, blah. But if the nurse had an insight about something that patient needed, they'd be dismissed. They would be dismissed. And that I found really shocking because by this time, feminism was the thing, starting to be the thing, right? And yet I didn't see a lot of that in my profession, in the nursing profession, in the allied professions. I saw that women were expected to sacrifice themselves to the nth degree and be grateful for doing so. It was crazy. It was crazy. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And it's like, that when that perpetuates, and then it's like, again, that reward and punishment that you see with that just perpetuates the cycle. And then, what I've found is like you become very disconnected from yourself. You start to lack trust within yourself.
Absolutely.
And then it just continues everything to the point where you're like, everybody else is an authority except for me. And that's a very scary place. And we see that in so many places currently, where we are looking outside ourselves for the solution rather than within ourselves. And that's a really challenging place because, again, to come out of that, and like I can say for myself, when talk about authenticity, I was not living an authentic life for much of my life, and I had no idea. Because, again, like you say, you're rewarded. You get the grades, you get the praise, you get all the things that people say should make you happy, and then you're looking around, you're like, I'm not happy. Why am I not happy? Because I should be happy. And then now you feel almost guilty because you're not happy, and it's just this like mess within your head because you're not in alignment. And
absolutely.
yeah.
That's a great way to put it. Great psychiatric jargon. A mess in your own head. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
For the first little while when you're waking up to how something's not right here, your immediate response is, there's something wrong with me. Why don't I align with this? I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Like, what's wrong with me? And this is where it is really crucial to find community. That's another big thing about authenticity is, yes, you need time alone to really learn about yourself. And it's really helpful if you have community of people who are also questioning the status quo and are there to support, not judge. But that can be a tall order too. right?
Mhm.
And you have to start moving out of your family circle, of your social circles. You have to sort of distance yourself. I'm not advocating that people cut themselves off, but it does require a kind of, emotional distancing and looking at the landscape of your social world and saying, I don't know if I fit here any longer. And
Mhm.
who here in this group would support me in my journey to become more authentic? And
Mhm.
that's the next truly scary place, of course, is like, am I going to be,
Yeah.
cast out on an ice floe in the Arctic?
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
I just don't fit in anymore, right?
Exactly. If it very
Mhm.
much feels like that because you have been conforming, so people expect you to always conform, to always, make sure their needs are taken care of. And the minute you stop doing that, it becomes this rift in these relationships. And it is so true. I've lost many relationships in
Mhm.
me really connecting with myself. And I think it's so important to talk about this because I didn't know that was part of this journey, and you get into it and you're
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, like, you're losing some really close people. And yet, like, it almost feels right deep down in your soul that, like, no, this is where I'm supposed to be. But then externally, again, it kind of almost tells you you're on the wrong path because you're like, but this is someone who's been in my life my whole life. How am
Mhm.
I losing them? But yeah, I know I have to do this. And it is that like push pull. So I think it's so important to talk about this because if anyone's listening, they're starting to wake up to themselves. It's important to know it's not just sunshine and butterflies when we talk about authenticity. This
Mhm.
is a real journey. And do you
It
mind
is.
talking about that a little bit further, like the changing in dynamics when you start to anchor into yourself?
Well, I'll tell you a story. Way back before authenticity became such a buzzword, this
Mhm.
was at the dawn of time. I was already into private practice as a psychiatrist, and I had a group of female friends who were all professionals, highly intelligent, beautiful, beautiful women with really lovely hearts. But we got into a really dysfunctional pattern where we would get together, like say on a Friday night, have a few drinks, and immediately the conversation would turn to dissing our boyfriends. Everybody would start ventilating about how, oh, he does this. Can you believe what he did? Blah, 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 blah. And it became this kind of feeding frenzy on the boyfriends. And I had by this time done enough work on myself that I could actually, I feel a visceral feeling of how ugly that started to feel. That it was almost to the point where I was getting nauseous. And I had known these women for a long time. I admired them. We'd had so many wonderful experiences together. And at the same time, I realized I was losing my soul the longer I was coming to these things. And I would try to do things like, change the topic, that sort of thing. Well, the topic changed for like, 5 minutes, and then it went back to the complaining. And I thought, oh my God, I really can't do this. And I really don't want to give them up, but this is killing me. So what I did was I gradually distanced more and more. I didn't go to them as much. And finally I said, enough is enough. And I called up my best friend in that group one day and I just said, I'm just calling to say goodbye, because I knew her position was they weren't doing anything wrong. I mean, this was great. This was great fun. And I said, blessings to you. I just can't be part of this any longer. So I'm moving on, and I wish you all the best. And then what happened was I had a period of a vacuum in my life. And I knew enough about the law of attraction at that point that I realized that, okay, let me just envision the kind of community I want. And I will just surrender myself to that vision. I will keep envisioning. And it did take me a while to start forming up a new friend group, and it was like lonely. for periods of time. But then the friend group that I then formed was healthier. It was certainly a lot healthier than what I'd experienced before. And I felt that I kind of needed that gap, between the old friendships and the new ones, so that I could kind of rewire myself as well, up level myself. But that's not an easy journey. A lot of people would not be comfortable with that. But a lot of people do that. I've heard many people who said they had to just kind of, say goodbye, become a hermit on the mountain, so to speak, for a while,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
really up level before they could get back into community.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, because it's such a, I mean, that's such a real experience. And I think it's like sometimes that space of feeling like you're alone, it's like you can almost easily get sucked back into that old group, that old relationship, because you can always find an excuse for like, well, is it me? Am I just being like too sensitive? Am I just like, you can very much ignore your inner knowing to go back into that and find a reason to. So it's like, I love that you shared that about that space, because it just gives you that time to really anchor into like what you want versus like what was the old patterning.
Yeah.
And that's so absolutely key. And just kind of going off into that, when you start to really anchor into who you are and like who your soul is, can you talk about what that feels like for someone who maybe it seems like such a foreign concept? And we've talked about how like it's challenging to go into that place. So it can feel like, okay, well, why do I want to do this if it's challenging? Can you talk about some of the good parts of it? What are the things you gained by really connecting with yourself, by choosing different people to be around? What are the blessings that come along with that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because we, in our essence, are meant to be, I think, far more than what we are. Okay, so when you go on this journey, you start, seeing your potential, and you start walking into it, so to speak, walking into your potential. For me, I developed a lot of confidence. Not that I felt that I was, infallible, I could never make a mistake, but I thought, if I can weather this and create something better in my life, wow, it's kind of like, oh man, the sky is the limit. And it develops a sense of greater desire for more, to experience more, to do more, but to do more and experience more in a way that is in alignment, with who you really are. When you have that alignment, it's not like you never get nervous or anxious or afraid. You will, because you are taking more risks, more chances, you're expanding yourself. But then there's a tremendous sense of satisfaction, when you have accomplished what you've accomplished. A lot of people that I, for example, see in the medical world, because I do see my colleagues. I don't, I'm not in a clinic or hospital setting, but before the pandemic, I would go to conferences. I'd see my colleagues here and there. And a lot of them were terribly scared of the thought of being in private practice. And they kind of asked, how do you survive out there in private practice? And literally that was a question, and it boggled my mind, because I thought, how do you survive in the toxic soup of the hospital?
Right.
But I had to jump and run. When I was in private practice, it was kind of like I had some colleagues that I could talk to, but really I didn't have the massive structure and the massive educational system backing me up. And I had to learn, flying by the seat of my pants, all the stuff that now comes naturally to me. I had to learn things that I never encountered in my medical or psychiatric training. And I'm always learning, right? And I am blessed that I have the freedom, as I said earlier, to be in a private practice where, if I see that I need to train myself in a certain way, or I need to learn something because I have a client who comes to me and they've got an issue I haven't really understood very well. I have to train myself. I'm really comfortable in doing that. You know, I know where I can, find the resources. I know that I can learn. I know that I can apply what I've learned. And I do not have to give my power up to a hospital administration or, hospital committees and all of that stuff. And because I'm doing psychotherapy, you really have to anchor into yourself to really serve the client. It's not just about, well, oh, tell me your symptoms here. I'll write out a prescription for you. Go take it and then come back in 2 weeks and tell me how it worked. You really have to develop yourself as a human being when you're trying to help other people on that deep, deep level of psychotherapy in a way that really helps people. So I would say I have the blessings of going down this route to authenticity are you do become much more yourself, and you realize you can keep expanding and keep expanding and keep expanding. And the world then, your world then becomes so much richer and fuller. And you are able to draw more of the stuff that you really need to you, as opposed to staying safe and stagnant, which is a misery, A lot of people that come to me with chronic depression and anxiety are in that state where they have confined themselves to such a small area of life that they're caged and very afraid of going out there and have no confidence in themselves. And that's really tragic. That is tragic.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that growth, I think that you're just talking about, like, I think that's literally it. It's like, we're all lifelong learners, and it's like, as long as we're growing, we're expanding. I think that's really where a lot of that joy comes from. And from, I've seen, like, my own personal life and people I work with, the angst comes from that untapped potential. Like, somewhere deep down in yourself, you're capable of more, but there's just that resistance that you're meeting within yourself. That then becomes this angst of, like, it's not happening right now, and you're not moving into that. And so I love that you talk about that growth and that freedom. That's such a big word, and just something that I think we all desire, is that freedom to be who we are and not be restrained, and to really bring our unique gifts, because we all have them, and everyone, just like our fingerprints, is uniquely designed to be here and create something that's their own. So I absolutely love that. And for someone who is listening to this and is like, how can I connect to you? Where can I find you? Where can they find you?
Oh, a couple of places. You can mostly find me on Instagram at Lucille Necas. And I also have a podcast that I run with my partner in crime. I call her Lynn Hardy, who's also on Instagram. She's at The Aging Games. And we run a podcast called The Rewilded Human. So our mission is to help people cast off all the unnatural stories, incorrect assumptions, belief systems, etc., that are blocking them from being their true, essential human self. So the Rewilded Human podcast. And you can get that on pretty well any platform. I do not take on any clients for psychiatry because I'm in Canada. We have socialized medicine. You have to be a Canadian citizen, blah, blah, blah. So that's not a route of entry. So basically, those are the two ways of connecting with me. So it's through Instagram and the Rewilded Human podcast. And by the way, for the podcast, we very much welcome people submitting questions to us, because a lot of it is question and answer format. So if you find me on Instagram, you can submit questions and feel free. And we will not reveal people's true identities. So Those are the two main ways to contact me.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. I'll put everything in the show notes. So definitely connect with Lucille on Instagram, listen to the podcast. And I just cannot thank you enough for everything you shared today. There's just so many golden nuggets of wisdom that I just hope someone listening is taking them and just helps them move the next step forward in their life. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Kelly. And I really appreciate all the work you're doing as well. And I will continue to follow you because I really, really think that you're doing some valuable work. But thank you also for giving me this platform.
Absolutely. And thank you again. And thank you for, for everyone listening. If you do have any questions or comments about this episode, please feel free to share them. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Rewiring Health. I hope you found our conversation both enlightening and empowering. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to Rewiring Health so that you never miss an update. Also, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you could take a moment to rate and review the show, it would mean the world to me and help others discover the power that we all have within us to create change and create the life that we truly, truly desire. Thank you so much for spending your precious time with me and sharing the energy of the show.